Before we get started, just a couple of details. One, just to let you know, a couple of events that we have upcoming, our next major events for the Institute is our inaugural Public Health Summit, which is going to be March 1st and 2nd in Washington. It's an invitation-only event, but if any of you feel that you're appropriate for it, you'll see information online. You can be in touch with us about it. It'll be, I think, a great 2 days dealing with the importance of wellness and prevention in the fight against disease and illness. And then on May 1st to 4th, we have our 19th annual Global Conference. It's going to be another great event at the Beverly Hilton. Once again, it'll be at capacity, which is 3,500 people. We'll have probably close to 700 speakers again on around 140 different panels, public panels, and other 50 or 60 private ones covering 11 different themes and topics. It's going to be a great event, and it's going to be really something special. And I know, looking around, there's several of you here who are regular attendees, and so hope you'll be with us again for that. And then just a couple of details. Mr. Kalb has agreed kindly to stay behind after tonight's program, and he'll sign copies of his book, which is for sale tonight right over in the corner, thanks to our friends at Barnes & Noble. And I know you'll want to stay for that. And following the discussion between our speakers, we're going to open it up to your questions. Now, we take, as those of you who have been here before know, we take our questions electronically. So there are two ways that you can do it. You can send it anytime, either via text or email. The numbers are up there on the screen. If any of you do not have handheld devices, feel free to grab one out of someone else's hand and put in your face. All right, great. All right, with that, as you know, we're delighted to have Marvin Kalb with us tonight. He's written a very impressive book, and he's going to have a great deal to say to us. And he's going to be introduced this evening by our moderator. Jerrold Green is the president and CEO of the Pacific Council on International Policy, which is based here in Los Angeles. Jerry has been leading that organization for a number of years, and under his leadership, it really has become the leading voice in the area of foreign policy in Los Angeles, and one of the leaders in the country. It's an organization of business and civic leaders, policy wonks like me, aspiring leaders with a commitment to international affairs. And as I say, he's done just a wonderful job, and under his leadership, it has prospered. And before the Pacific Council, he held multiple positions at RAND Corporation, including director of the Center for Middle Eastern Public Policy. He's taught at the Center for Near Eastern and North African Studies at the University of Michigan. He was director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Arizona. And most importantly, he has a degree from the University of Chicago. I'm going to turn things over now to Jerry, and please join me in welcoming them. And again, you're in for a great night.
Thank you. Thank you. What Mike Clouden neglected to mention is he is a trustee at the University of Chicago. So we should have gone to see Martian together. Matt Damon, announced in the middle of Martian, he's a USC grad. So, but enough of that. I really want to thank Mike and Milken for inviting me here tonight. I'm a very provincial guy, so I'm all about Los Angeles and Los Angeles' global role. And the Milken Institute really plays a unique role in this community, not only in terms of the annual meeting, which is extraordinary, but its day-to-day research on all manner of things. So it's really a privilege to be here. I want to introduce Marvin Kalb, and I was telling him that I took one issue with his book, which is his biography in the book is so modest, it is so terse, you have no sense of who he really is. All it does is a very lengthy list of publications with no biographical information, which I think a number of us, people my age certainly, are really we're very familiar with. The word icon is abused and I had an iconic hamburger. Icon used correctly describes very few things, and really Marvin Kalb is an iconic figure not only in the field of American journalism and television journalism, but also in the very small and shrinking cadre of people who are experts on the former Soviet Union and today Russia. This is a diminishing and disappearing breed, which is unfortunate. He's currently a fellow at the Brookings Institute in Washington. He was educated at Harvard. He spent time at Harvard. He spent time at George Washington University. He has written 9 nonfiction books and 2 novels, which is far more than
12 and 2.
Huh?
12 and 2.
12 and 2, which certain presidential candidates, you know, hope someday to read that many books. I don't know if they're working that hard on it, but when you've written more than people have read, you know that the world is in trouble. He spent 30 years at CBS and NBC. For people of my generation, he has the equivalent of a Nobel Prize, which he was on Nixon's enemy list, which again, people of my age is a big, big deal and a remarkable lifetime achievement. He hosted Meet the Press, which again, you know, many of us spent our lives watching. Chief diplomatic correspondent for NBC. And he also worked with his brother, Bernard Kalb, who was also himself a very distinguished journalist. So my very first question, I want to welcome you to Los Angeles.
Thank you.
What did they feed the Kalb kids for breakfast? I mean, how do you produce 2 of you guys? I mean, 1 is a lot. 2 from the same family is remarkable. And to be both journalists as well.
Look, I am a very, very lucky man. I had a strong-willed, highly intelligent mother who dominated the environment. I had a father who was smart enough to recognize that fact. And my father was an intensely curious man. And so they produced 2 sons and a daughter. And my sister, who passed away last year at the age of 94, was very much, forgive me, the kingpin of the family. And we're all a bit lost without her now. Bernie is, in a week, will be 94. And
this is what we say, Ken O'Hara, by the way, some of us anyway. Ken O'Hara.
I am of a Jack Benny age of 39. No, but we all work very hard. I mean, people who think that you can go into journalism these days, and as a matter of fact, a couple of years ago, a student came into my office and he said, with a kind of firm voice, "I want to be an anchorman, and I want you to teach me how to be one." I said, well, what have you done? What have you covered? He said, I haven't covered anything. But it doesn't seem to be terribly difficult. You just read one of those teleprompter things. I flunked him, by the way. Bill O'Reilly was one of my students, too, many years ago. And my mistake with him was that I passed him.
In the realm of journalism, one of the many things that distinguishes you is you are actually a real, serious, no-kidding expert on Russia, the Soviet Union, and now Russia. You speak the language, you're familiar with the history, you're familiar with the culture, and one of the things that I wonder is, what was it like being, when you were a young man, your first trip, you're still a young man, a younger man, your first trip to the Soviet Union as, I guess, a graduate student at Harvard. What was it like, and how does it compare to what you've seen when you travel to Russia today?
Well, it was very interesting, actually. And what I remember very clearly, I was a graduate student at a place up at Harvard called the Russian Research Center. And it was blessed with a faculty of extraordinary talent. And there were historians and sociologists, economists, and they were all experts in their field. And what they tried to do, and I think succeeded, was fill us in on what was the reality of the Soviet Union. We're talking about 1950, 51, 52, 53, in that range of years. And when I went for the very first time to Russia, On January 26, 1956, I remembered two things vividly. One, it was 42 degrees below zero. And when I stepped out of the train, I quite literally gagged because I could not breathe, and immediately went back into the train. And a guy from the embassy grabbed the tail end of my coat and pulled me out and said those comforting words, "You'll get used to it. It's fine." The other thing was that I was not surprised by what I had seen in the Soviet Union. The people who were at the Russian Research Center and who were students at that time were very well trained. If you had somebody, a sociologist, for example, like Alex Inkelis, a historian like Richard Pipes, people of that quality, they knew their subject inside out, and they were all terrific teachers, so that if they could impart both the knowledge and the enthusiasm about the subject to their student, they were ahead of the game, and they most certainly were. So my second thought was, here is the Soviet Union. I'm now here. I'm going to be here for 13 months. I might as well really learn the language. I knew it before I went, but knew it and being able to speak it fluently are two different things. And I picked up the latter in that 13 months. And secondly, the idea, Jerry, about getting to meet people who had simply been subjects in books, and to meet a series of Russians, many of them. I was 25 years old, and I was working at the U.S. Embassy at that time, hired simply because I happened, for work I did in the Army, have a security clearance of a level acceptable at the embassy, and they needed somebody who spoke Russian, and they needed that person immediately. And so I'd never been to Russia, but I'd been studying the country then for about 4 years, and the man who ran the Russian Research Center, Marshal Schulman, was a former speechwriter for Dean Acheson, and he called me into the office and he said, "How old are you?" 25. Married? No. Footloose? Yeah. You want to go to Russia? Yeah. And he said, "Can you leave in about a week?" I said, "Yeah." And the next thing I had to do, which is an amusing tale, I went down to the State Department, and we were being briefed. And I remember it was on the 4th floor of the State Department. I remember the room, as a matter of fact, and a man who took himself very seriously was in State Department intelligence. And he looked at me from his desk, barely looking up, and he said, "Young man, do you realize what you're getting yourself into?" I said, "Not quite." He said, "Well, you're unmarried, and I assume you're..." He was looking for me to say. I said, "I'm all right. I'm all right. I'm all right." He said, "The problem is, because of that, Russian ballerinas are apt to make a pitch for you really fast. You got to be extremely careful because they're going to get all kinds of secrets out of you. Watch your step." I said, "Yes, sir." And in my mind, I was saying, "Oh, come on." So I was there for 13 months, and I must tell you the sorrowful tale, not once did a Russian ballerina make a play for me, not once.
Let me to something slightly less pleasant and probably less interesting too. But what is it that we need to know about Putin? You know, sort of thinking of Putin as a product of Russian history, Russian culture, Russian society, the KGB. I'm just convinced that those of us that don't know a lot about Russia, do not know of what he is a product. What do we need to know about Putin? I mean, he's certainly a thug, and he's not a likable guy, but you know, that's sort of from Washington, D.C. His numbers, you know, when I was last in Moscow, were higher than our president's
Oh,
amongst
way
his own
above
people.
that.
So, you know, obviously he's doing something right in terms of his own country. How does, you know, knowing what you know and most of us don't, how would we assess and evaluate and understand?
Okay, I'll try to limit my answer to a 50-minute lecture. Vladimir Putin is a product of the Soviet Union, that aspect of Russian history. That means he is a beneficiary or a victim of Soviet education. Soviet education was conformed to a communist vision of reality, and that meant that you received a very narrow slice of the world, and you were not familiar, and it was specifically pointed out to you that you could not be familiar with Western civilization, the Renaissance, all of the things that we take an educated person's familiarity with those subjects to know. He knew none of that. He wanted only one thing, and that was to be an officer in the KGB. And he succeeded. Along the way, he picked up a law degree. He is very smart, cunning, street smart, cunning, and very tough. He has a vision of Russia as a besieged country. The world is against us. The West, led by the United States, is on a crusade. And in that crusade, they want once again, as they did during the Cold War, surround us, hem us in, make it impossible for the true genius of the Russian people to shine. And I am here to make sure, Putin, I'm here to make sure that that is not going to happen. And we all know that in 1991, the Soviet Union disintegrated. That, Putin believes, was the great calamity of the 20th century. He truly believes this, and I want to make a sort of a parenthesis point here. In doing this book, Imperial Gamble, I had to read, and I did read, just about every single thing that Putin ever said or ever wrote. And one of the things that comes through from this reading is that Putin means what he says. He does not lay out a plan in his mind or in his articulation of what's in his mind different from the policy he intends to follow. So if he says something, you can take him at his word. He intends to move in that direction. He truly believes that he, at this stage in his life, after having been the leader of Russia now for 16 years, represents the best interests of Russia. And there's a saying in Russia today, which a lot of the kids are taught, Russia is Putin, Putin is Russia. And it comes together in their minds as an accepted fact. And if it is an accepted fact, you can have an 86% approval rating. I don't believe those ratings are that high in fact, but nevertheless, that's what the PR people put out. 86% is pretty high. What's interesting is that Putin believes those numbers. And that's important. And it's particularly important because if he believes that he represents the best interests of Russia, he is not going to give up power simply because his term ends in 6 years. You have to get used to him and where he is. He will either die in office or as a result of some huge national upheaval, which Russia is prone to do every 100 years. As a result of that kind of upheaval, he will simply be thrown out. It's not a matter of Putin. I mean, there's stories about him collecting $42 billion stashed away in a Swiss bank account, I believe to be utter nonsense. Putin does not need, he doesn't think in terms of a retirement fund. He is a guy who believes more than anything else that because he represents Russia, is in the best interest of Russia, and the rest of the world had better get used to that. He feels he's going to be there forever and a day until the day he dies. And he has utter contempt for the President of the United States. He has very little respect for the Western world at this stage. He believes that he, not in the West, but he in Russia, although Russia is economically damaged goods, very serious economic problems now, and political problems. But he doesn't allow people to think in those terms. He thinks the world is coming to get us. I stand between you, the Russian people, and that aggressive world. You listen to me. And so he's got these high ratings. He's going to be in office for a long time. And the danger here is that he will come to think that he is such a genius that he can do nothing wrong. And I think he's going to find, for example, Jerry, that the move that he made into Syria on September 30th of last year, I think that will prove to be one of the stupidest blunders he has ever made.
Let me ask you, I want to sort of move towards the book, which I've read, and I was going to actually ask you to autograph my iPad. So I bought a Kindle, but I would encourage you all to buy to get the real one so you can share it with people. But based on what you've just said, how does he perceive, and how do the Russian people perceive what he has done and what they are continuing to do in the Ukraine?
Let me back up for a second in the answer to that question. For Russians, Ukraine is not a new, separate, independent country. Ukraine is part of the Russian Empire, part of Russian tradition. Any Russian leader since Ivan III in the middle of the 17th century understands that Ukraine, or not even drop that word, but that territory down there has always been Slavic, it's Orthodox. It's part of our world. It isn't even that the Russians owned or demanded a certain kind of response from Ukrainians. It was simply, they're one of us. And Putin has said this 1,000 times now. Kievan Rus, which was a small region around the capital city of Kiev, back in the 10th century, was a vibrant trade route. It was a place where Slavic, Orthodox merchants, businessmen, military people gathered. Putin looks back upon Kievan Rus 1,000 years later and says, that is our beginning. Kiev is our mother city. The language is our language. The religion, Orthodoxy, is our faith. There's nothing that different. Now, when he took Crimea in March of 2014, did he really think he was taking something that belonged to him or something that belonged to somebody else, but he had a right to take because it should have belonged to him? And the answer is the second one. He feels that he didn't do anything all that wrong. In the West, we regarded it as a strong, severe violation of an international code of conduct established since 1991 that Russia had been invited to join, didn't, as it turned out. We Russians, I'm being Putin here, we Russians feel that if you want to deal with us, you have to recognize that Russia has a sphere of influence through all of this region of Eastern Europe. If you don't buy that, you're not my friend. If you accept that, you are accepting, in his mind, history, the logic of history, simply the way it is. Think about for a second Crimea. Crimea has been officially part of Russia since 1783, when Catherine the Great pronounced that it's part of Russia. Up until that point, the Tatars had lived there. Many people had come through, Turks, Circassians, a lot of different groups, mostly Tatars. When the Russians took over, what did they do? As they do in most places they take over, they kicked off the native population, either transporting them somewhere else or killing them. And they moved Russians in. So when Catherine said it's ours, it was already Russian. In 1954, there was an argument about a dam. It was a silly argument about management and administration. The leader of Russia at that time, Nikita Khrushchev, said, because it was all part of the Soviet Union, I don't care if you want to call this Ukrainian, call it Ukrainian. And so on the 300th birthday of Ukraine's accession into Russia, he technically gave it to Ukraine, but since it was all part of the Soviet Union, it was never in the Russian mind detached from Russia. And what I'm trying to get at here is that we tend, in America certainly and in the West, to dismiss historical precedent. We think everything in America started yesterday. It didn't. There is a history to the world. It's a complicated history. It's an important history. And we have to understand it, or we cannot understand what is happening right now in the world. And my own gut feeling, I mean, when I started doing Imperial Gamble, the publisher wanted me to write about what Putin had just done in Ukraine and in the Crimea. And I said to her, she's a very, very intelligent person. I said, I can't do that until I explain what the history is between Russia and Ukraine. Then when you read about Russians taking it, it's in a context. You understand their mind as well. So if you want to reach a deal, which gets to the heart of your last question, and forgive the long-windedness, if you want to reach a deal, know who it is you're dealing with. I mean, I don't know. I assume you're all involved in the business of one sort or another. You always want to know, if you're striking a deal, who's on the other side. What is driving the other party? If you end up thinking that you can strike a deal because you know the other party, great, and you'll probably get the better of the deal. But if you walk in ignorant of what the other party wants, and not only ignorant, ignoring what the other party represents and stands for, you cannot get a deal, in my judgment anyway.
Which leads to my next question, and this is not a partisan political question, it's a systemic question.
Mm-hmm.
Does our policy community understand this?
No.
Why not?
No.
Why, do they
Absolutely
understand
not.
it and ignore it, or they just don't even understand it?
No, it is, I think, one of the sad stories of the last 30, 40 years. When the Cold War ended in 1991 officially, most people who led the United States, and I'm not talking just about the president, the cabinet, and the people who are in the Congress, the leadership of America thought, whew, thank God that's over with now, and we can get back to living a normal life, whatever that was. But they never wanted to deal with Russia again. It was something to be ignored. A very dear friend of mine, Bill Sapphire, who used to write columns for the New York Times, in the mid-1990s, Bill did a column in which he praised the extension of Western power through NATO toward the Russian border. And I thought and think that was a pretty stupid idea, but nevertheless we did it. And Bill did a column that day in which he thought it was the greatest move since Mother's Milk. It was absolutely terrific. And I saw him at dinner that night, and I said, Bill, I think you went way, way overboard today in your column. He said, Marvin, you're such a sweet guy. You're so naive. Don't you understand that when your enemy, I remember, when your enemy is down, step on him. Bill was a very funny guy, but he was reflecting the attitude of the government. And that government then was led by President Bill Clinton. In other words, whether you were of the left or the right in this country, you looked upon the end of the Cold War as a time for us to take a deep breath, forget about all of the problems associated with the Cold War, and do something new and magical and wonderful and American. Except we were turning our back on reality. And in Russia, the people like Putin got increasingly angry and resentful that NATO was moving troops and its strength right up to the Russian border, and they were asking themselves at that time, what did we do to deserve this kind of negative Western response? And they couldn't quite figure it out. And Putin is a little more extreme in this than many, many Russians I know. He really feels that there is a conspiracy. It's an ugly conspiracy. They want to bring us down. They want to humiliate great Russia. They want to take the glory of Tolstoy and turn it into a comic book. He is angry at the West, and he wants to get even. And right now, he has spent an awful lot of money building up the Russian military. The Russian military today is quite strong. In no way a measure, by the way, let me quickly add, to the American military, but much, much stronger than it's been in the last 25 years. And when Putin looks out at the West, he sees a divided West, a weakened West, an America in which Trump may win, an America in a state of political confusion and dysfunction, and he feels he's not quite in the catbird seat, but he is close to getting into it in his mind, which makes it extremely dangerous. Because if the leader of the opposition has a totally unrealistic vision of what's going on, he can have whatever view of Obama he likes. But the bottom line is that the United States is not going to bend over and die because Putin wants something to happen. We're at a moment now when he ought to be smarter, but unfortunately he lives in an environment where that may not be possible, but we live in an environment where it is. And it's inexcusable for us not to know more about Putin, not to know more about what he is trying to do.
I find that really interesting because and again, as a civilian and non-expert on Russia, I often wondered, were we not bad winners after the Cold War?
That's a good one.
You know, you think back to after World War II, our policies in Japan, MacArthur preserving the, you know, we made an effort to treat the country with respect, and it turned out pretty well. They play baseball and, you know, men are other gifts. But I often wondered if our not knowing how to win has not continued to haunt us. And again, it's a version what some of the older folks in the room will remember is the ugly American, that we really were not graceful in victory. And, you know, if we ever win something again, that, you know, which is questionable,
well, one of the
maybe
things,
we'll do it better next time.
But an interesting point here, because one of the things to bear in mind is that we tended to look upon the Cold War when it was in play, that we were the righteous ones up against an evil force. Now, there were many evil people in that system, and the system itself was an atrocious one. When I went there in '50, I mean, one of the things that was so obvious, the sadness of bright young Russian minds having to live in a vice, an ideological vice that was pathetically inadequate for the needs of the time. It is a very bad system of government. But there were Americans who thought of themselves as much as the Christian missionaries going into China in the early part of the 19th century. We were there to bring God to the people who were too stupid to understand. And we looked upon the Russians in much the same way. They looked upon us in a similar way as well. So it's, backwards.
Let me ask you, if one of the, and this won't happen, I'm sure, but if one of the presidential candidates actually had the political courage and the wisdom to call you and ask you, not on ideological reasons, but practically, what should U.S. policy be towards Russia? What would you recommend? Is it too late to course correct? Is Putin, gone so far and so in love with his own ability to ride horses without a shirt and to shoot holes in one and all the other miracles that he has, or is it not too late? I mean, is there a way that we could actually improve our relationship with Russia and improve Russian behavior?
No, it is not too late. I think the first thing you do is buy a copy of Imperial Gamble. Seriously, the second thing that you would do, read history. Start with a simple history of Russia, whether it's Bernard Pear, somebody else, Vernadsky. Just begin, read, fill your minds, put yourself in the other guy's position. Try to understand where Russia is, what it is trying to do, bearing in mind that the Russian people are an intelligent people. They are now not the way they were at the beginning of the Soviet experience, but now they are an educated people, they are a literate people, they're connected to the new technology, they know what is going on in many parts of the world, but they live in an environment that is unbelievably tight. And there were a couple of studies which prove that 90% of the Russian people who watch Russian television about the world, 90%, believe 97% of what it is that they're being told. Now, put that in an American context, you'd laugh. It's absolutely ridiculous. You believe nothing. But they believe almost everything. The Russian reporters, cameramen, editors, and producers who covered the war in Ukraine are now in Syria, producing it in the exact same way. It is a story of Russia coming to the aid of poor people being oppressed by the imperialist West, and especially by the United States. And we in Russia are, in effect, the children of God. And there's a heavy religious component now in Putin's grasp of Russian political power. And the Russian people are religious. They do feel a close association with the church, the Orthodox faith. They also, if you read any Russian literature, there's a special feeling that Russians have for the land, for Russia. They believe, they use phrases like Mother Russia, but believe it, that out of the soil emerges, it's the womb from which Russian nationalism emerges and is born and is treasured. We can think about that as they're in a dreamboat, but it's their dreamboat. And they can look at us and not understand us, and we sure as heck do not understand them. In the 1990s, a university like Harvard did not have a major professor do anything on Russian history. An amazing, simple fact. We didn't have anyone teaching Russian history. My daughter teaches Russian language and lit at the University of South Carolina. And because she and her husband are such terrific teachers, their classes are filled. And so they win all of these prizes for teaching simply because there's no competition. No. They're really quite fabulous. But there is nobody there truly to test them. And that is in many, many universities around the country today. I was at UCLA this afternoon and heard sad stories about the state of Russian studies in America. So we have, if Russia has no good excuse to know more about us, we certainly have no good excuse not to know more about them.
You know, I'm a Middle East specialist, so I would say very similar sorts of things about my part of the world where people work hard to not learn the language but have endless opinions, most of which are not terribly valuable. But it's argued that the best book about the United States was written by de Tocqueville, a Frenchman, and one wonders, could de Tocqueville have written that book if he didn't speak English? Can you really understand a country if you can't read a newspaper or order off a menu, or tell a joke, and so forth? So this is really a profound challenge to this country. This is not just one guy or perhaps two guys talking. You're absolutely right, and our inability to navigate globally is compounded by our unwillingness to work hard, study history, and so forth. Which brings me to my final question. I want to open it up to all of your questions, but I'd like to end up with the current state of journalism. I will share a view. I read a lot of newspapers, and I don't watch TV journalism. Just because somebody can buy an airplane ticket from CNN and get to Tahrir Square doesn't mean they have anything to tell me that's of any value at all. But it's one of the great virtues of our country. Is our history of journalism, and I'm including social media and newspapers, TV, and so forth. Is there room in journalism for people with your skills? I mean, is it an asset or a liability to actually know something? Because if you know something, that means you can't report on something that you don't know as much about. And I really wonder, could someone with your background make it today as a journalist?
Look, in May of 1957, Murrow called me into his office and offered me a job. And he had in mind that within a year after learning what a microphone looked like, I would be sent to Moscow by CBS and be the Moscow correspondent. He was very much of the view that we ought to have people in Russia who spoke the language, knew about Russian history, knew about Russian literature, could really explain and give context to the important facts of the day. And this was something that Murrow had in mind. Is there a Murrow today in the news business? And the answer is no. Whoever said that is right. And what that means, unfortunately, is that attitude is not there. The emphasis right now for people in my former line of work as a radio or television correspondent is the technical mastery of the new technology, the skill with which you can figure out how to get a story from one place to another in lightning speed. The emphasis is not on what you're transmitting in lightning speed. It's that you're transmitting something live. And that word live is used over and over and over again. So the emphasis, the point of view, the mindset is totally different. But I rush to add, there are still marvelous reporters doing their work, and many of them in extremely dangerous parts of the world, and risking their lives every day so that people in the rest of the world can find out what indeed is happening in Syria or Iraq or India or China or wherever. So this is not to be seen as a blanket condemnation. It is simply to be seen as an explanation of the difference between then and now. But the function of journalism remains the same. And I'm absolutely convinced that if we have a virile journalism, we will have a virile democracy. And if our journalism is weakened as a result of flaky ways in which political campaigns are covered, as this one is, the effect is not direct, it's indirect, but it happens that the democracy that we all cherish is going to be weakened. It'll wither, because the two are intimately connected. If you have a solid press, you will have a solid democracy. You go around the world, and wherever you have an autocracy, a dictatorship, some kind of totalitarian form of government, you do not have a free and independent press. Everything becomes a function of the state. In Russia, Russian television giving the Putin line is accepted by 97%. 97% of what they put out is believed by 90% of the Russian people. That is not even remotely a reflection of what happens in this country. So I'm going on, but I feel that this point is so important. We've got to, I feel that there is a urgent need for us to hold American journalism's feet to the fire, demand a better quality, ask questions of it, ask why are you doing this, what do you know, what's going on, have them feel that they have the responsibility, which I believe to be true, for the health of our country in their hands, so that it's not so easy. The whole idea that because you have a new technology and you can do things so easily, and everybody has a gadget in his hand, you flick, blah, 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 and you're all over the world. You know, you're all over the world so fast that you pay no respect to any part of the world that you passed. Everything is quick. Bingo. And my own gut feeling is that we're in a precious moment in our democratic history now, and we ought to be more demanding of our politicians and demanding of the media that presents politics to us.
Thank you. I hope when you were at USC today and UCLA,
Thank you.
they were listening.
Thank
We're now going to turn to your questions. And the first question is a really important one, which is what's going to happen to Russia if the price of oil continues to be at record lows?
Well, the number one commodity that Russia has is oil. And when oil is weak, Russia is weak. The Russian economy today is staggering, and it is weaker than we imagine, and certainly weaker than Putin allows to be expressed. There are now stories of strikes popping up in different parts of the country. There was a major strike last month of drivers bringing major products into the Moscow region. We are watching just the very edge of something important and something big that is just on the edge of happening, but it hasn't happened yet. So when the price of oil goes down, Russia goes down. And we have to be mindful of the way in which it goes down and under what kind in what kind of situation it ends up. Because bear in mind, they've got an awful lot of weapons. And at the moment, Putin uses them but doesn't really want to use them. Somebody asked me once, who's the guy who will follow Putin? What sort of guy will follow Putin? I said, bear in mind only one thing. He may be worse. That does not necessarily follow that he's better. He may be worse. And if he is worse, with all of those weapons, with Ukraine hanging there, with Syria hanging there, might he move against the Baltic? Absolutely possible. And if he did, the Baltic, that's part of NATO. Article 5 of NATO says an attack on one is an attack on all. Will the United States of America today, the leader of NATO, send its troops to fight the Russians in Estonia or Latvia? I don't think so. I hope not, was one answer. We are not of a mood now to fulfill the obligations to which we are obliged. And when you think in these terms, it's very tough to face reality, but the reality is that there's a guy sitting in the Kremlin right now who thinks you can be had. And he's just, the book is Imperial Gamble. He's so much of a gambler, he just may gamble that he can take you to the cleaners. we hope not.
Which leads to the next question, which is really an interesting question, which is you said that Putin has contempt for President Obama.
Yes.
Does he have contempt for all America? I mean, we know he admires Donald Trump. I mean, he said that. But other than, no, really, he did. Does he have contempt for all American presidents, or is it simply Obama?
Well, he has only dealt with two American presidents. One was George W. Bush, and the other was Obama. With George W. Bush, when Bush saw him for the first time that they had a summit, some of you will remember that Bush felt that he looked into his soul and saw somebody with whom he could deal. I remember that Margaret Thatcher once looked into the soul of Mikhail Gorbachev and thought that this was a leader with whom one could deal. Westerners have a way of thinking when they meet a Russian leader and he doesn't spit in their eye that he's really a wonderful man. We are living in a fool's paradise if we think that. I believe that Putin right now, while not in the catbird seat, thinks he's awfully close.
This is a interesting Russia-related question. Do you have an opinion on whether or not Snowden's revelations compromised U.S. national security? And since he's living in Moscow, or somewhere in Russia, there's sort of a Russia angle to that as well.
Yeah. Well, I happen to believe that the answer to that question is yes. And I know that there are a lot of people who feel that what Snowden did is a wonderful thing because he actually stopped the state from intruding too deeply into our personal lives. And that may, in fact, even be the case. But I am one who believes that there is a limit to the amount of secret information that is made public. And I know for a fact that any number of operations were compromised as a result of Snowden's disclosures. I believe in a very old-fashioned way that if you sign an agreement with the United States government, that you're going to work for them, you're going to be paid by them, and you have an obligation to live up to that agreement. And the agreement that he signed said that there's secret information and you don't give it to anybody else. And he did. I think that's wrong.
I'm going to modify this question a little bit. The question is there still a possibility it could be a nuclear exchange between the U.S. and Russia? But I would broaden it as the possibility of military conflict between the United States and Russia, which, you know, in the worst case could be nuclear, but certainly on lower levels could also be quite significant.
The answer is yes. I mean, there is certainly that possibility. Is it likely? And the answer there is no. Because when we think about conflict, we tend to think about it in the old Cold War terms, as if armies will move across borders. Putin doesn't do that anymore. He plays with his little green men. He plays with cyber warfare. He plays with all of the new gadgets at his command. And he does not feel that he should, for example, occupy Ukraine. There's no need for that when he can control the destiny of Ukraine by occupying only a small part of it. So he's not a fool. He's not going to be moving armies. He's going to do it in his way, and that means that we have to be super smart. And one area, just to expand on that, we have to have a president who levels with us about what it is that are the commitments of the United States abroad. What are we obliged to fight for? What should we consider to be a distinct national security interest of the United States? And if something is defined as a national security interest, and you have a debate about that, and then you conclude that debate with an acceptance by both sides that this is in the national security interest, then you have to defend that. If it is not in the national security interest, you don't have to defend it. And you can play around with it in a number of different ways. But let us not play games. There are too many serious things happening, in the world today. And if we're serious about our own lives and our children's and our country's, then we have to level with one another about what it is that is a real interest to us, what it is that we would really fight for or not, and be clear about both.
What once Putin leaves the scene, which once he has Castro's doctor is inevitable, what's the succession likely to look like, and what's the future of democracy likely to be in Russia? I mean, since the Cold War, we've seen really pretty jagged assertions of democracy and then retreating from democracy and so forth.
I think that you should not hold your breath about democracy invading Russia anytime soon. It's going to be a long, long time before that happens. The Russian people, as a people looking back in their history, had one time between 1890 and 1914 when there was a sort of beginning of democracy, a beginning of a market economy. And in the 1990s when there was a bit of democracy, but it led to utter chaos. So it isn't in the character and the history of Russia to have a lot of democracy, so we can't really be absorbed with that terribly much. The key thing we should look toward as outsiders looking in is what are they doing that affects us in a negative way that will hurt us dramatically. And we have to be aware of what that is so that when it happens, as a people, we're lined up to do whatever is responsible, whatever it happens to be that is the national consensus on any issue.
The question on here we've already asked and answered, so if we could move to the next one, that would be great. Oh, perfect, okay. Someone's asking they would like more detail on the implications or the negative consequences of Russia entering Syria, which is a good
Thank
question.
you for that question, because that's my favorite. Think about this for a second. Russia today is a country with 141 million people. Among the 141 are 21 million Sunni Muslims. 21 million Sunni Muslims. 2 million Sunni Muslims live in Moscow. Most of the Sunni Muslims live in the northern Caucasus in Russia, in a place called Dagestan and another place called Chechnya. We've had 2 wars in Chechnya and Russia in the last 20 years. In what used to be Soviet Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, those stans, there are 68 million Sunni Muslims. Their economic condition is pathetic. If you went there and listened to their sermons, either in Dagestan or Central Asia now, on a Friday, their sermons and the clerics doing the sermons, in terms of message, no different from ISIS. Exactly the same message. There is a building radicalization within the Muslim quarters of Russia. Now, Putin picks himself up for reasons that we can all explain and go into detail on if you like. Putin decides to go into Syria in a big way. He is the unofficial leader of a Shia Muslim coalition involving Iran, Iraq, and Syria. That is in opposition to a Sunni coalition, more or less led by the United States. In Syria today, in a very narrow airspace, there are American and Russian warplanes flying side by side, back and forth, hitting different targets. Imagine for a second just one mistake. It wouldn't be deliberate, just one mistake. The Russians shoot down an American plane. Or we shoot down a Russian plane. We wouldn't have a war as a result of that, but it gets itchy. It gets nasty. and it's already nasty. I believe that in Russia itself, the 2,500 Russian Sunni Muslims who went from Dagestan down into Syria, and the 7,000 Sunni Muslims who went from Central Asia into Syria, pick up terrorist skills that are then brought back into Russia. Not too far from here, we had an example in the United States of what could happen with a little bit of. Exactly.
And if I may, the two Boston Marathon bombers
Yes,
from Dagestan.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so we've had a little taste of it. The Russians have had much more. Why somebody as smart as Putin would go into the Middle East and put himself in a position where he gives ammunition to Sunni Russian Muslims every Friday to absorb this hate and this radicalization is beyond me. And I think he's made a terrible blunder. I think Russia is going to pay a huge price. And how that emerges, I wouldn't be surprised if in the next month or the next year, we have something like another Chechen war within Russia itself.
Someone's asking yet another very good question. We've been talking about U.S.-Russian relations. What about Russian-Chinese relations?
The Russians don't like the Chinese, and the Chinese have no respect for the Russians. When Putin, after taking Crimea and moving into Ukraine, was in a sense for a while iced out of the Western coalitions, he looked east, and he looked toward China, and he struck a big natural gas deal with the Chinese. The Chinese put that in their hip pocket because what they are doing is moving in economically into what was Soviet Central Asia, into what is Siberia, and they are doing it with the best of intentions. They just want to make money. And along with the money comes political control. And I'm not saying by any means that the Chinese are in a position to establish a beachhead in Siberia or anything like that. They've already got little economic beachheads all over that region. And that is the way they're pushing themselves out. And if Putin feels that President Xi Jinping is going to change his policy because of this deal, he's in a dream world. The Chinese they're very smart. The Chinese will do what they want to do, and Putin's no fool. He'll do what he wants to do. Those two countries have fought many wars. They've been in a treaty relationship since the Treaty of Nerchinsk in the 1680s. So they've had a lot to do with one another, but a lot of it has been based on hostility. And during the Soviet times, they hated each other, even though there was a common allegiance to communism.
What about Israeli-Russian relations, and specifically relations between Putin and Netanyahu?
They're fascinating right now. The Israelis don't trust the Russians at all, except that 1 million Russian Jews came to Israel about 15, 20 years ago. And they are now citizens of Israel and live in Israel, their children born in Israel, and they are part of the various Israeli political parties. But they left Russia because they didn't want to live there. Now, numbers of them are going back. And numbers of them are also going back specifically to Ukraine. And the fascinating element here is that Ukraine has a history of anti-Semitism that is very deep. The blood of many, many, many millions of Jews is spilled in the area of Ukraine. At the very beginning of World War II, when the Nazis came in to Ukraine, in many of the small villages in the western part of Ukraine, they were greeted as as liberators from Russia and from communism. And so the relationship is really very fraught. The new Ukrainian government, appreciating that, has really bent over backwards to be nice to Ukrainian Jews and hopefully draw some of them back into Ukraine. It's a limited number that's gone back. It's not a big deal at all. But they try very hard to turn the corner on the anti-Semitism to make it seem as if they're not really as bad as they were. The specific relationship now is fascinating between Netanyahu and Putin. They have a deal struck when Netanyahu, about 6 months ago, visited Moscow, that you, Russia, can do whatever you want in Syria, but don't get close to our border, because we'll hit you if you do. Likewise, the other way around, Israel. You don't mess around in Syria. That's our place to mess around with right now. So they have this understanding. And quite a few times now, the Israelis, if they spot a cargo of military equipment that could be used for terrorist purposes in Israel, they will ignore the deal and strike in Syria against the target. But immediately Netanyahu picks up the phone and calls Putin and says, this is what we did. So calm down. This is what we did, and this is the reason we did it. So there is more communication now between Netanyahu and Putin than there's ever been. And the Syrian war is the reason for that. It could all end in an instant because neither trusts the other. But it's what they both need at this particular time simply because it's in each national interest to do so.
The next question we talked about, but I'm going to change the focus a little bit, and the questioner specified this as well. What's being asked as a journalist, how do you rate the level of U.S. political journalism? And here, not in terms of U.S.-Russian relations, but it could be moderating presidential debates, the coverage of politics in the United States. I mean, your career as a journalist, you did everything. You didn't simply cover Russia. So much more broadly, what's your assessment of your profession's handling of political news?
Well, if any of you remember what I said about the state of the relationship between journalism and politics and the strong link between the two, what I say now will not surprise you. I feel that American journalists today, especially television journalists, and especially moderators and anchormen, have bent over backwards and unnecessarily to accommodate the interests of presidential candidates. Journalists are not supposed to accommodate the interests of presidential candidates. They're supposed to cover them and be tough about that coverage. I love Chuck Todd, but I did that program years ago, and there is no doubt in my none that if we went back to the way we did things then, and the way I think it should be done now, if a politician like Trump, I mean, I'm not being negative here, I'm just describing. If a politician like Trump calls on a Sunday morning and says, I'll be on your program if I am on top of the program and you accept me on the telephone because I'm busy now and I don't want to come down to the studio. I would say, Mr. Trump, thanks very much for your call and we'll see you next year. You cannot allow a candidate to determine when he goes on the show and in what form he goes on the show. The Meet the Press, no, it's serious. Meet the Press is a television program. That means you see the guy. It's not a telephone program. But Trump has decided that it's to be done by telephone now. And he should never have that right to do that. No, 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 no. That's a no-no. And it is also the case that when reporters are interviewing Trump, he has a style which is big and burly, and if the reporter asks a question, he doesn't want to answer it, Trump generally first denounces the news organization. Then he goes into a long speech about whatever the heck is on his mind, having nothing to do with the question. But there are a lot of people in this room who remember my dear colleague Sam Donaldson. Sam would never have allowed that to happen. Sam would have interrupted Trump and said, "Mr. Trump, excuse me, sir, that is not my question. My question is X. You're talking Y." We don't have that any longer, or very little of it. And I don't know why. Where is Trump going to go? I mean, he wants to be on television. He's going to have to obey the rules of the road. I mean, it's like Putin deciding after 1991 that he's going to do it my way and not the Western way. Well, this is something that journalism has a primary responsibility for making sure that the American people get the whole story of a candidate, not the image that the candidate alone wishes to project to them.
We're back to it. Thank you. It's quite
Welcome.
interesting, and it makes me feel a little less crazy because you're sort of confirming things I've long believed. A Russia question again. Does Russia have an aging population? Does it share some of the?
It's an aging population, but at a much lower age level. Russian men are dying on the average in their late 50s. Russian women in their mid-60s. That's much better, by the way, than it was 20 years ago when it was really considerably worse. Russian men down to 52%, 52 years rather. The reason, there are many reasons. One reason is alcoholism. There's a tremendous amount of drinking in Russia, much, much, much more than you can imagine. And if you go out of Moscow, but even in Moscow you could see, but you go out of Moscow into the small towns, I mean, you see men walking around at 10 o'clock in the morning, sloshed. And so that's one major reason. Another reason is that when you're out of Moscow and St. Petersburg, the medical facilities are terrible. I read a report recently about the city of Chelyabinsk. If you're sick and you go to the hospital, you have to bring your own sheets and pillows. They may give you a bed, likely they will not. Russian doctors, when they're lucky, travel to the West to buy supplies, which they then bring home to places like Chelyabinsk, but all over Russia. The medical facilities are very poor. They drink too much. The diet is way, way overloaded on starch, and they die much too young.
They probably smoke a lot too.
And they smoke a great deal. Yep.
Our next question is about NATO. And I'll never forget going to NATO headquarters a few years ago and seeing Russian officers in uniform walking around. I mean, this was, for having grown up during the Cold War, it was unimaginable. But that's as it was. How does NATO sort of look at Russia today? And, would it be effective against Russia?
NATO looks with the deepest suspicion on Russia. And NATO would like right now, if you were to listen to all but the Americans, really, but all of the Europeans, it's a funny game that is played. The Europeans are very tough on Russia, except they expect that the United States will provide the manpower to be really tough on Russia. The NATO people think primarily of their economic and political interest. They talk a big game about Russia, but they're not really prepared to do very much. They all sit back and wait for the United States to lead. And that's what I meant before about whether, if the United States does not lead, then the likelihood is that NATO, whether a year, 2, 5, will disintegrate, will just wither away as a useless World War as a useless first Cold War organization. NATO, it's a funny, there's a lot of funny stuff going on now. And one of the things, Jerry, is that they're not serious with one another. They talk a game that is serious, but they don't back that up. And so they talk in terms of how Russia is awful and we will never accept Russian control over Crimea. Thank you very much. What are you going to do about it? And the answer is nothing. And so Putin says, God, bug off. You know, I mean, he cannot take seriously what is going on now in NATO. And that's why I think it's a point that I made earlier. We have to know what we're serious about. If we are, then we've got to back that up. And if we're not, don't. That's fine. But it has to be a decision that we reach as a people.
The final question is, a number of people, myself included, would really value your response to this. What 2 or 3 histories of Russia would you recommend for those of us who are not, at your level of expertise? And I'm going to add to the question, who do you listen to on Russia? When you talk to Russia, I mean, I'll tell you who I talk to about Iran, which is there's a guy in Tokyo who's the leading Japan specialist on Iran. And I'm always seeking him out because he's in Iran all the time and he's Japanese. So he can do things that Westerners can't. So who's what are the histories and who do you listen to about Russia? Who do you, from whom do you learn about Russia? Because we're always in the process of learning.
Okay. The first book I would buy is Imperial Gamble. That's the first one. The second book that I would buy is War and Peace by Tolstoy, which is, in its way, a marvelous insight into Russian history and to the people and the mindset of the Russian military and the Russian aristocracy and how they see war, because believe me, not that much has changed in the last 150 years. Not that much has changed at all. In the classic old formulas of Russian history, the book done by Bernard Pears, a British, no longer with us, historian of Russia, he did his books in the 30s and 40s of the last century, were marvelous works on Russia. There's another historian named Vernadsky who taught at Yale until he died. His books are also splendid histories of Russia. But if you really want to understand the country, read the literature. After you finish one of these books, read the literature. Read Tolstoy, read Dostoevsky, read Turgenev, read Gogol, by the way, a Ukrainian who wrote in Russian. His inspiration, he always said, came from Ukraine. But the legitimate language of literature, he said, was Russian, not Ukrainian. Now, if you said that today to a Ukrainian nationalist, they'd shoot you. But in those days, in the 19th century, there was an awareness that of the two countries, Russia was in the lead, clearly. And today, the great split between Russian nationalism, Ukrainian nationalism, is the following. A Ukrainian nationalist vision of Ukrainian history is that you go back to Kievan Rus, and the Ukrainian today says that was our first Ukraine, and we went directly from that into what we have today. In my judgment, that is pure fantasy. But nevertheless, that is what Ukrainian nationalists say about their country today. Russian nationalists say that Kievan Rus was our common source. Kiev, Putin says, the first capital of Russia. They bring it in together. And if you try to deal with it from a Russian perspective, you will be denounced by the Ukrainians. You turn it around, and you're probably doing yourself a disservice to accept it from a Ukrainian point of view, just from the point of view of history itself. So whatever whatever you do, keep in mind the reality of what's going on. Russia is always going to be there, and Ukraine is always going to be there. And if there's to be any kind of getting together on both sides, it can only happen. It can only happen when leaders of both sides are able to deal with each other and respect each other. At this particular point, there is no leader in either Ukraine or Russia who is prepared to respect the other. And so no deal is realistic. It can't happen. You can have a war, but if you want to strike a sensible working relationship, Ukraine with Russia, you can't do it unless you have different political leaders. And that could take time, but it is definitely the better way of doing it than having an all-out war between the two sides.
I want to thank all of you for coming. I want to thank the Milken Institute for hosting us, and I particularly want to thank Marvin Kalb, who has said that he's willing to sign some books after the session.
And thank you so much for living up to all of our expectations that this was going to be an absolutely fascinating evening. And if you want to buy the very first book on Marvin's list, please line up over there. Thank you.